Hello, Mr. Andy here. Today we're going to talk about configurations in SolidWorks. We use configurations when we have multiple versions of a part where the different versions may have a change in dimensions or a change in features, but are basically the same part or of the same family. So we can have multiple configurations in a single file, or if you will, multiple part numbers that either have a different dimension or added or turned off features. The term we would use is suppressed or unsuppressed. So let's take a look. Up here in Feature Manager, at the top there are a row of tabs, and I'm going to click on the Configuration Manager here. And you'll notice that right now we have one configuration. It's called Default, and that's what you get when you start a new part file and build something. So I'd like to add a configuration. I'm going to right-click, not on Default, but right-click on SW19 up here and add a configuration. I'm going to call this configuration V2 for version 2. And we'll just hit OK. You'll notice now I have two configurations. I have Default that's grayed out, and V2, which is in normal, or you can see that the tree here is gold. That tells us that this is the current configuration, and Default currently is turned off. If I double clicked on Default, that becomes the current configuration, and V2 is grayed out. When you have multiple configurations and you make changes to the part, typically those changes only apply to the current configuration, not to all of them. All right. So let's go back to V2, and I want to rename Default. I'd like it to be V1 for first version. So I'm going to right click and go to Properties, and we'll call this V1, and I'll just hit Enter. So there we have our two versions, V1 and V2. V2 is our current configuration. So let's make a change to the model for version V2. I'm going to go back to Feature Manager. I'm going to edit my base sketch, and I'm going to double click this 9mm dimension. So first of all, I'm going to put in a new dimension, and let's make it 11 inches instead. But there's one more thing we have to do. Right over here where my mouse is, there's a button here, a drop down button, and right now that drop down button is for all configurations. So if I hit OK, it's going to change that dimension for all configurations of this part. Not quite what we want. So I'm going to click on the drop down here and change just for this configuration. So you have to be very careful when you're changing dimensions, because the default setting for the dimension modify box is all configurations. So watch that. It's a common mistake. So for this configuration, and we'll hit OK. Likewise, I'm going to double click on the 6-inch dimension, and I'm going to change it to 7 inches again for this configuration only, and hit OK. I'll close my sketch, and you can see that now I have a much larger part than previously. If we go back to Configuration Manager, if I double click on V1, the part should shrink. And if I double click on V2, it should get larger. All right, let's go back to our Feature Manager, and let's add a new feature. So I'd like to fillet the top corner of the part. And I'm going to use a radius of 0.375. And I'm going to pick this top corner. And we'll hit OK. It's going to be a horrid yellow color. And now in V2, that's my current configuration. And you can see your current configuration, by the way, right up here. It tells you which one you're in. Let's go back to the Configuration tab, and let's double click on V1, and notice that the fillet disappears. So when I add a feature like that, it only goes in the current configuration. I could turn it on in this version if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. Now we have lots of holes in this part, and the other change that I'd like to make to V2 is in V2 I'd like to suppress this 4-hole pattern right here. So we have to find that 4-hole pattern here, and I think it's right there. It was the first thing I did, wasn't it? Here's the countersinks, and I like to suppress this, so I'm going to click on it and hit suppress. That's this gold to gray here. That turns that feature off. Again, if I went back and looked at V1, we should find that the part will get smaller, the fillet will disappear, and those 4 countersunk holes reappear. Okay. Well, in V1, let's turn something off just so you can see that it can be done. And let's turn off maybe the 2 holes that are at the very outside edges. So let's suppress those. Okay. So I've turned those 2 holes off, and again, if we jump between the configurations, those holes should come back in version 2. All right. So the 2 configurations we have now are just normal configurations. I would call them parent configurations. You can also create what are called derived configurations or child configurations. So let's take a look at that. For version 2 here, I'm going to right-click on it and add a derived configuration. I'm going to call this version 2 no holes. And if I click on the plus mark here, you can see that it's underneath. I'm going to right-click on version 1 and add a derived configuration. And I'm going to call this V1 no holes. So you can see now that version 1 has a child underneath it, and version 2 has a child underneath it. A derived, or as I call them, child configuration, will have all the same dimensions and features as the parent unless you modify certain features or dimensions. So let's see what that means. On the V1 no holes, let's just go turn all the holes off. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to suppress all the holes. So we'll just click on each one and suppress it. And one more. And all the holes are gone. We'll go back to the configuration tab. Let's make V2 active. Remember, it's different now. It's a child of version 2, so it's got the fillet and it's got a different pattern suppressed. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to suppress all the holes. And so there we have version 2. Let's go back to our tree for just a minute. Here's no holes. Here's version 2 that has the holes. Version 1 no holes, and version 1 with holes. So this is kind of handy if you want a version of the part that maybe is the raw blank stock before those features are added, or maybe the cast part, or whatever the case might be. You can kind of do it in this way. One more thing here. I want to show you how the child resembles the parent. I'm going to go to version 2, make that active. By the way, you can also right-click and say, whoops, that's my current one. You can right-click and say show, and it will take you to that one. But double-clicking is much faster. So I'm in version 2. That's my active configuration. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to change those dimensions again for base extrude. I'll show you a different way to do it. I'm just going to double-click on base extrude and light those 2 dimensions. And let's make this dramatically bigger. So we'll go 14 inches here. And I'll double-click on this one, and let's go 11. Notice, by the way, that once you've modified a dimension for a single configuration, it stays in that mode. But if I picked any other dimension, it would change. We could change the thickness of the part, though. Let's do that. So let's double-click the thickness of the part. Let's make that 3 inches for this configuration only. Okay, now we're going to rebuild the part. Up here at the top, the little traffic light. It's going to get much bigger, and it got thicker, I hope. Yep, so it's 3 inches thick, and it's now quite large. And now let's take a look at our configurations and see what happened. So version 1 should be unchanged. Should be the original small part with just the 2 holes suppressed. There is the no hole version. Now version 2 has gotten huge now. And version 2, no holes, should be the same size and the same thickness because those were inherited from the parent, but with no holes now. So there you have it, a quick introduction to configurations in SolidWorks. Enjoy.